I used to think a midnight phone call could only mean an emergency, not the end of 15 years of my career. But when the CEO calmly told me that my position had been eliminated effective immediately, I understood that I had not merely been fired. I had been treated like a cost line that could be erased with a few rehearsed sentences. They believed dashboards, data models, and a newly hired vice president could replace the experience I had used to keep $2 billion plants alive for years. They were wrong, and the price of that mistake was not one chaotic night, nor a few delayed shipments. It was the collapse of an entire operating system they had never truly understood. My name is Clara Morrison. I am 49 years old. And until one late-night phone call in the middle of the week, I was the woman responsible for keeping the two largest plants at Atlas Industrial Systems running like a living organism with a precise heartbeat. One facility was in Houston, the other in Beaumont, and both served heavy equipment contracts for the oil and gas industry, where a single delayed day could create enormous losses for a client. For 15 years, I did not simply manage maintenance schedules, supply chains, steel vendors, hydraulic presses, or overnight crews. I learned to read the mood of a production line through the smallest movement on a monitor. I knew when an alert was harmless noise and when it was the first whisper of a disaster. I once believed that dedication, competence, and results would protect me from foolish decisions made above my head. I was wrong. Ethan Callaway, the CEO who loved to talk about innovation, optimization, and digital transformation, called me while I was monitoring a critical order for North Star Energy. His voice was so calm it felt inhuman. There was no proper opening, no respectful explanation, no acknowledgement of the years I had poured into the company. Just the announcement my position was being eliminated immediately. In that moment, I was not shocked because I had been betrayed. I was shocked because they had chosen the exact moment the system needed me most to prove they had never understood what I actually did. When the phone rang, I was sitting in my home office with 3 white-lit monitors glowing in the dark. One screen showed the Houston production dashboard. Another showed the Beaumont steel delivery schedule. The third held a chain of messages between overnight supervisors and supplier teams. To an outsider, those charts might have looked like data. To me, they were the bloodstream of the company. A drilling equipment shipment for North Star Energy had to be completed before dawn. Houston's main hydraulic press was showing signs of pressure timing drift. Beaumont was waiting for a steel delivery that was arriving earlier than expected. And if the sequence was mishandled, the next day's Gulf Bridge petroleum shipment would be affected. In my head, I was already connecting the pieces, which Houston line should slow down, which Beaumont maintenance team should stay on standby, which supplier needed to be called first to prevent a bottleneck. Then Ethan told me the company was restructuring. He used polished executive phrases like consolidating operational oversight and digital transformation efficiency. All I heard was emptiness. They were not talking about machines that were already running. Workers waiting for decisions, or customers counting every hour. They spoke as if production were a spreadsheet where one row could be deleted, another inserted, and everything would balance itself. I asked who would take over the current shift, because critical decisions needed to be made within the next few hours. His answer chilled me. Madison Reed, the new vice president of digital manufacturing. I had never heard Madison Reed's name before. At a company like Atlas, that alone was dangerous. No one should be placed above major plant operations without speaking to the person actively running both facilities, unless leadership has already decided that experience is no longer worth hearing. Ethan said Madison had a background in data analytics, manufacturing optimization, and a fresh perspective on operational challenges. I stayed silent for a few seconds. Not because I lacked an answer, but because I had to stop myself from laughing bitterly. A fresh perspective cannot replace knowing which supplier tends to arrive early when Gulf weather shifts. Data analytics does not automatically know which hydraulic press needs extra calibration time when humidity rises. Someone who has never stayed awake through a production crisis cannot glance at a dashboard and understand why a small alert can become a major failure. I asked whether Madison had been briefed on the orders, the equipment, and the emergency protocols. Ethan said she would receive complete transition documentation, Documentation. 15 years of experience reduced to a few folders, a few access permissions, and a handful of procedure files. At that moment, I understood they were not trying to transfer a living system. They were only handing over keys. If you have ever watched a company damage its own foundation through arrogance, comment the number 1 so I know you understand that helpless feeling. I tried to warn Ethan one final time. I told him that stopping operational oversight in the middle of an overnight shift could cause cascading consequences: equipment failure, missed delivery windows, production misalignment, and even safety risks. I was not saying it to keep my job. By then, the respect was already gone. I said it because there were still workers inside those plants, contracts backed by my credibility, and a system so complex that one wrong decision could push everything off track. Ethan listened like a man waiting for me to finish so he could continue reading a prepared script. He said Madison was ready. He said the company believed in its transition plan. He said I needed to stop all operational activity and transfer access before 1 a.m. Every word landed like a nail being driven into the coffin of what I had built. I looked at the monitors and saw the alerts still blinking. Houston needed a pressure decision. Beaumont needed its steel schedule coordinated. The overnight supervisors would be waiting for me, as they had for years, whenever a situation went beyond the standard procedure. But from the moment Ethan said effective immediately, I no longer had the authority to protect that system. I asked whether he wanted me to brief Madison on the current status. He said it would not be necessary because she preferred to assess things independently rather than inherit assumptions from previous management. Previous management meant me, the woman who had raised Atlas's operational efficiency to the level the board proudly showed investors. After the call ended, the room became so quiet, I could hear the computer fan beneath my desk. I sat still for several minutes. Not because I was weak, but because there are moments when a person needs time to understand that her loyalty has just been discarded in a polite voice. Then I began transferring access as instructed. One system at a time: production dashboards, supplier communication networks, equipment maintenance schedules, quality records, emergency contact lists, and protocols I had refined by hand over the years. Each confirmation felt like removing a nerve from a body that was still alive. Those systems were not just software. They held the traces of countless nights I had stayed awake until morning. Countless times I had prevented a minor issue from becoming a major loss. Countless calls in which I used personal credibility to persuade a supplier to move faster, reorder, or prioritize Atlas when no one else could. Near 1:30 in the morning, Madison called me. Her voice was young and confident. But beneath the confidence, I recognized a gap immediately. She did not yet know what she had stepped into. She asked whether I could give her a quick summary of the night's status. I told her I had transferred access and that she now had full operational responsibility. If you think this story is exposing the real cost of dismissing experience, please leave one like on this video. Madison tried to keep her voice professional, as she asked whether there were any urgent issues she should watch. I looked at the screens. I was no longer legally responsible for controlling, and told her to check the production schedules, supplier delivery status, and equipment alerts. I mentioned that Houston had hydraulic press timing issues connected to the North Star Energy order. I mentioned that Beaumont had a steel coordination flag affecting Gulf Bridge Petroleum's shipment. She repeated the 2 plants and 2 clients as if she were taking notes for a routine meeting. Then she asked whether there was anything else. That question filled me with a cold, deep sadness. Anything else was 15 years of experience. It was thousands of small decisions that never appeared in any job description. It was knowing which shift supervisor tended to delay reports out of fear of blame. It was knowing which supplier required a direct call to the warehouse manager instead of an email. It was knowing when to be honest with a client before a problem became a breach of trust. I told her that overnight supervisors could handle routine issues, but non-standard situations required experienced operational oversight. Madison asked whether she could call me if she had questions during the night. I paused. Part of me still wanted to help, to rescue, to prevent damage, but Ethan had made me an outsider. I told her clearly that I was no longer an Atlas employee as of that call. She needed to contact Ethan or the plant managers. The silence on the other end told me Madison had also realized she had been thrown into the fire without armor. After the call with Madison, I turned off some of the monitors. but I could not turn off what was still running through my mind. I stood by the window and looked down at the city lights, feeling as though I had stepped off a ship while still hearing the engine roaring behind me. Atlas's 2 plants were running through the night. Hundreds of people were working inside rhythms I had helped design. And the new person in charge had not even expected to start immediately. That was no longer an administrative oversight. It was recklessness disguised in executive language. I wondered how many times in leadership meetings Ethan had looked at my compensation line and decided the company could save money by replacing me with a title that sounded newer, younger, cheaper, and more digital. He did not see the midnight calls. He did not see the times I stopped a bad decision before it became an industry headline. He did not see the network of trust between me, suppliers, supervisors, plant managers, and clients. To him, operations were systems. To me, operations were judgment, memory, responsibility. My personal phone began buzzing because plant supervisors were still reaching me by habit. I watched their names appear and turned the phone face down on the desk. Not because I did not care. Precisely because I cared. I understood that I could not keep carrying the burden for a company that had voluntarily cut away the person holding its pulse. The next morning, I woke with a strange feeling for the first time in years. I did not need to check production reports before drinking coffee. But the quiet did not last. My phone was filled with missed calls from shift supervisors, plant managers, and maintenance engineers. Messages kept appearing, questions about press pressure, whether to hold a steel batch, who could approve a change in production sequence, and why Madison was not responding quickly enough. I read them with a mixture of sympathy and anger. They were not calling me because they wanted to undermine Madison. They were calling because, under the old system, when a situation moved beyond the manual, I was the person who connected the scattered pieces. By mid-morning, Ethan called. His voice had lost the cold smoothness of the night before. Now it carried tension wrapped in politeness. He said the company was experiencing some operational issues and needed my immediate assistance. I reminded him that I no longer worked for Atlas. He said Madison was having difficulty getting oriented and asked me to come in for temporary transition support at emergency consulting rates. I could almost hear the panic behind each word. The night before, they had framed me as an obstacle to digital transformation. The next morning, they wanted to rent that obstacle back to save the system. I declined. I told him I was exploring other opportunities. And if you want to hear how a woman they underestimated turned her expertise into her greatest advantage, subscribe to the channel now. Ethan did not accept my first answer. He moved from requesting to negotiating, then from negotiating to something close to pleading. He said this would only be temporary support. He said the board could discuss reinstatement, even improved terms. I looked out my kitchen window at the steady flow of morning traffic and wondered why people often recognize the value of something only after they have broken it themselves. If Ethan had called me before firing me and honestly asked where the operational risks were, I could have shown him dozens of transition points, hundreds of dependencies, and thousands of details that could never fit into a document folder. But he did not do that. He chose administrative convenience over operational reality. Now that reality had started pushing back, he wanted me to return as if my dignity could also be billed by the hour. I told him there was no consulting rate high enough to make me rescue such a disrespectful decision. He asked what it would take for me to come back. I told him it would take a time machine, because no one can eliminate accumulated knowledge and then expect to rent it back once the system begins to crack. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I did not feel triumphant immediately. What I felt first was freedom. A heavy but clean kind of freedom, for the first time in 15 years. My professional future was no longer in the hands of people who did not understand its value. Atlas did not collapse like a single explosion. It began with small misalignments, with decisions that sounded reasonable only if the person making them did not understand the hidden structure underneath. On the first morning after I left, Houston's main hydraulic press shut down. On paper, the cause was an unexpected equipment coordination issue. In operational language, that meant Madison had not understood the protocol I had built to balance steel delivery timing with pressure calibration. A steel shipment arrived earlier than expected, and instead of holding it until the press had enough time to stabilize, she approved immediate processing. A decision that looked efficient caused pressure to drift outside the safe range, triggered an automatic shutdown, and stopped the line. I learned this not because I was still monitoring the system, but because former colleagues messaged me through professional networks. Shocked and upset, their messages were short. Things like, "Have you heard about Houston?" or "No one knows how to handle the override." I read them with a tight feeling in my throat. It was not because I wanted Atlas to fail. I had spent too much of my life there to want to see it burn. But I also could not deny the truth. What was happening was exactly what I had warned them about. A complex system does not only need accurate data, it needs someone who understands what that data means in context, how to respond to it, and when not to trust the deceptive simplicity of a number. By afternoon, Beaumont began slipping out of rhythm. Madison tried to compensate for Houston's delays by accelerating parts of Beaumont's production schedule. If each plant were viewed separately, that decision might have looked proactive. But Atlas had never operated like two independent islands. Beaumont did not only produce for its own targets, it also supplied specialized steel assemblies Houston needed to maintain its heavy equipment line. Over the years, I had built the coordination between the two facilities like a conductor, keeping an orchestra in time. When Houston slowed, Beaumont was not supposed to simply run faster. It had to run the right segment, in the right order, for the right support requirement. Madison did not know that. She ordered Beaumont to prioritize independent deliveries to protect visible productivity metrics, unintentionally cutting off the components Houston needed most. The result was painfully ironic. Beaumont produced parts Houston could not yet use. While Houston waited for parts, Beaumont was no longer prioritizing. By the end of the day, both plants were operating far below acceptable capacity, and delivery schedules for North Star Energy and Gulfbridge Petroleum were no longer aligned with commitments. I imagined plant managers sitting in emergency meetings, watching dashboards turn red while Madison said she needed more time to assess the digital landscape. That phrase was almost funny in the saddest possible way. The real landscape was not inside the software. It was in the relationship between people, machines, materials, weather, clients, and time. Anyone who does not understand that relationship is only looking at a beautifully dressed corpse, no matter how many dashboards they have. That evening, Hannah Blake called me. Hannah had been my coordination assistant. Careful, discreet, and smart enough to know when a problem had grown beyond anything internal language could hide. The moment I heard her voice, I knew the situation was worse than the scattered messages had suggested. She said the office was in chaos. Madison had been trapped in emergency meetings all day. Plant managers kept asking who had final decision authority. Maintenance teams did not know whether to prioritize Houston or Beaumont. The client team wanted to send updates, but no one dared issue an official notice. Worst of all, Madison had suggested waiting until the next day to see whether the situation improved before notifying customers. I closed my eyes. In the oil and gas industry, silence before a serious delay is not strategy. It is reputational suicide. North Star Energy and Gulfbridge Petroleum were not customers who accepted last-minute surprises. They needed early notice so they could adjust rig schedules, labor, transport, and supporting contracts. A difficult call today might save a relationship. A late notice tomorrow could destroy trust built over years. Hannah asked what everyone should do. I wanted to answer. In my mind, the plan formed instantly. Call the clients now. Split orders by risk level. Move specific technical staff to Houston. Hold the Beaumont steel batch. Open direct supplier channels. But I did not say it. I told her Madison now had the authority and responsibility. Saying that hurt more than I expected. Sometimes professional boundaries do not make you care less. They only force you to watch consequences you no longer have the right to prevent. The news began moving outside the company faster than Atlas leadership expected. The oil and gas equipment manufacturing world is not large enough for a major failure to hide behind vague internal language. Within days, industry publications were reporting multi-facility production disruptions at Atlas Industrial Systems. Their language was diplomatic. But anyone in the industry understood the real message. Atlas was losing operational control. The stock dropped. Investors questioned reliability. And competitors were suddenly discussed as safer alternatives. I read those articles with deeply mixed emotions. Part of me hurt because Atlas had been the place where I placed nearly all my adult professional energy. I remembered the early days when efficiency was low, when the plants functioned like two departments speaking different languages, when I had to walk each shift, meet each supervisor, study each bottleneck, and pull everything into one unified system. I remembered the times Ethan and his executive team stood before investors proudly discussing operational performance without once mentioning the nights I fought behind the scenes. But another part of me felt that the truth had finally become visible. Not for revenge, but as proof that some forms of value only become obvious when they disappear. When the machines run smoothly, people think operations are natural. When the line breaks, they finally understand that the calm before it was the product of labor, knowledge, and countless decisions no one ever applauded. The heaviest blow did not come from the press or the stock market. It came from the customers. North Star Energy issued a contract review notice citing supplier reliability concerns. Gulf Bridge Petroleum activated contingency plans and began sourcing equipment from other companies. The wording of those letters was professional, but anyone in the industry knew they were red alerts. Once major clients begin building alternatives, it means they no longer trust you to keep your promises. To me, the most painful part was that those relationships had not been built through cheaper bids or a few pleasant dinners. They had been built through years of on-time deliveries, honest risk warnings, accepting responsibility before being forced to and proving that when things became complicated, Atlas could still stay calm. I had nurtured those relationships as part of the quiet work no one saw. I knew that North Star's procurement lead preferred an early phone warning before an email. I knew the technical format Gulf Bridge needed so its field team could act quickly. Those things did not appear in transition documentation. They lived in professional memory, in trust between people. Madison might have been excellent at analytics, but she could not walk in and immediately own years of earned credibility. In less than a week, Atlas leadership turned a durable competitive advantage into a pile of suspicion. The bitterest part was that they had once called that advantage a personnel expense. The board's call arrived on a Friday evening. This time it was not Ethan. The caller was Victor Hayes, chairman of the Atlas board. His voice was lower, more controlled, and much more careful. He did not use the word crisis. He called it multi-facility coordination challenges. I almost admired the leadership class's ability to soften language. 2 plants were out of rhythm. Major orders were threatened. Strategic customers were losing confidence. And the market had reacted badly. Yet they still tried to call it a challenge. Victor said the board believed my expertise could help stabilize the situation. He offered a short-term consulting contract with premium rates, emergency priority, and a flexible scope. I listened without the anger I had felt when Ethan called. Maybe by then I had moved beyond the first shock and could see the real nature of the problem more clearly. They did not truly want me back as a person who had once given years of service. They wanted to purchase my ability to repair consequences. They wanted to rent my memory, my relationships, my judgment. But they had not necessarily learned to respect the foundation that created those things. I asked exactly what they needed. Victor said they needed an immediate operational assessment and recommendations to stabilize production. I felt a long silence inside me. If that call had come before they cut me out, it could have been a strategic discussion. After everything, it was only a late knock at the door of a house already burning. I told Victor I could not consult for Atlas. He sounded genuinely surprised, as if he had never imagined that someone who had been fired might not be waiting outside to be invited back in. He mentioned significant compensation, room for negotiation, mutual benefit. I let him finish. Then, I told him I had accepted a new position. Meridian Industrial Systems had hired me as Chief Operations Officer to build its new oil and gas supply division. The silence on the other end was so deep that I knew Victor immediately understood what that meant. Meridian was not just another company. It was Atlas's largest regional competitor, and now it had the person who understood Atlas's strengths, weaknesses, operating rhythm, and exposed vulnerabilities better than anyone. Victor tried to recover. He said Atlas could surely offer terms competitive with anything else. I told him the issue was no longer money. If money had been the point, I would have returned when Ethan first offered emergency consulting rates. What I needed was leadership that understood operations were not a support department to be cut whenever a report needed to look cleaner. Operations were competitive capability. They were the reason customers trusted one company over another. They were what helped a business keep its promises when things did not go according to plan. Meridian, at least in our early conversations, understood that. Atlas understood only after losing it. Before ending the call, I told Victor that some business lessons are extremely expensive, and no one is obligated to teach them twice for free. My first day at Meridian felt like stepping into a room with entirely different air. CEO Evelyn Carter did not hand me off to human resources and disappear after polite introductions. She personally walked me through the facilities, asking about equipment protocols, supplier relationships, how I evaluated risk between plants, and which operational realities senior leaders most often misunderstood. At first, I answered carefully. After what had happened at Atlas, I was no longer quick to trust any CEO's polished language. But Evelyn did not merely nod for effect. She followed up with specific questions. How should a system respond if a supplier arrives early? If two facilities need the same technical team, who should set priority? If a major customer faces a delay, when must the company warn them proactively? Those were the questions of someone who understood that operations are not about pushing commands downward. They are the art of balancing real capacity against commercial promises. During one expansion planning meeting, Evelyn told me Meridian hired me because I understood something. Many executives missed operational expertise was not a cost center. It was profit generation. That sentence made me go quiet for several seconds. Not because it was new, but because I had waited 15 years to hear a leader say it seriously. At Atlas, I constantly had to defend budgets, staffing, and the reason experience needed to be retained. At Meridian, for the first time, I was asked to build exactly what I believed was necessary. 6 months after I joined Meridian, we entered the bidding process for Gulfbridge Petroleum's Gulf Coast expansion project. It was a massive contract that Atlas had once been almost certain to win. Atlas had a longer supply history, larger facilities, and older relationships. But history cannot protect a company once trust has cracked. Meridian entered the evaluation with a different advantage. We did not merely present production capacity. We proved how that capacity was protected. I built the proposal around operational stability, coordination between facilities, supplier contingency planning, emergency decision authority, and a method for preserving internal knowledge not only through documentation but through training, simulation, and explaining the reasoning behind each process. When a Gulfbridge representative asked what ensured Meridian would not repeat the recent problems seen elsewhere in the industry, I knew they were referring to Atlas without naming it. I answered that a system is only strong when the people operating it understand why it exists. We do not use data to replace judgment. We use data to sharpen judgment. A few weeks later, Meridian won the contract. I was sitting in the conference room when the official news came in. And what I felt was not revenge. It was the closing of a circle. Atlas had fired me because they believed I was surplus from the past. Meridian won the future because it understood that my experience was precisely what could help them enter it with stability. Over the following months, the difference between Atlas and Meridian became clearer. Atlas had to hire outside consulting teams at enormous cost, just to rebuild capabilities it once had internally. Those consultants were not bad. Many were highly skilled, but they arrived after the fact, looking at a system that had lost its memory, trying to reassemble fragments without having lived the history that created them. Every solution they implemented needed people to maintain it, adjust it, and understand why it had been designed that way. Atlas lacked the very people who could do that. At Meridian, we built differently from the start. I did not only write procedures, I required teams to record the reasoning behind procedures. Not only what to do, but why we do it, when it may be changed. And what signs show the process no longer fits? I trained the next layer of managers, empowered shift supervisors, built direct communication networks with suppliers, and established the principle that early warnings would never be punished. Results came faster than expected. Efficiency rose. Delays dropped. Customers grew more confident. And industry publications began describing Meridian as a new model for operational excellence. I started receiving invitations to speak at conferences, where executives often asked how they could digitize operational knowledge. I always answered plainly, you can digitize data and document processes, but you cannot replace judgment with slogans. If you want to retain knowledge, you must first respect the people carrying it. 2 years after that midnight call, Atlas was sold to a foreign oil services group at a valuation far below its peak. Analysts cited operational instability, weakened customer confidence, and the loss of institutional knowledge as major reasons. I read the announcement from my office at Meridian, where I now oversaw more facilities, more revenue, and an operations team I trusted deeply. I did not celebrate Atlas's decline. Too many good people had worked there, but I also did not pretend it was an accident. It was the consequence of a leadership style that treated experience as an expense, stability as automatic, and people as rows that could be erased from a spreadsheet. Ethan Calloway eventually left Atlas and moved through smaller roles in the industry. I heard he became obsessed with documenting knowledge and retaining operations staff. Lessons learned too late often taste like that. As for me, I kept one final quarterly report from Atlas, the one showing record operational efficiency before they fired me. I did not keep it as a trophy. I kept it to remind myself that what we build through discipline and understanding may be undervalued by others. But its true worth does not disappear. It simply moves to the place that knows how to value it. They thought they were cutting costs. In reality, they cut into the throat of their own business and accidentally handed the advantage to their largest competitor. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think about the value of experience and self-respect at work, please leave one like and subscribe to support the next stories.